Hello and welcome. I saw some feet walk across the back of the stage, so I know they're back there. Zali, you can come out now if you like. Firstly, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I know it's a school night, so we really do appreciate you making the time, especially considering how busy everyone's lives are. Also, an extra big thank you to those who have come out that have Year 12 students. I know it's a graduating week, so we do really appreciate you being here. My name is Nicola. I work with Zali. I'm the Electric Business Manager. And I, like the rest of the team, love my job, but it's tough. And it's tough because this woman standing next to me sets a cracking pace. And I know I've said that before, but it's like she's been in the Olympics or something. I don't know. However, I do feel very lucky to work with a group who are values aligned. The team does an incredible job of supporting the constituents in the area. And they do really help make sure that your voices are heard in Parliament. Every week we receive, every day we receive hundreds of bits of email. So apologies if we are a little slow in responding, but we do try and get to everyone. It literally covers everything: NDIS, aged care, immigration, superannuation changes, right through to post office closures and rising insurance premiums, which is one of the reasons why we're here tonight. But I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. I'm just going to make Zali wait for one more minute. If anyone needs to use the bathroom, you pass them on the way in, so please feel free to get up and go if you need to go. In case of emergency, exits are at the back and at the side. I feel like an airline, Stuart doing that. This event is being recorded. Thank you, Chris from Fish Media. He's here at every event with us. We really appreciate it, so please feel free to share this with your friends and family that couldn't be here. Feel free to switch off your phone if you are brave enough. If not, please put it on silent. Finally, on the way out, we actually have two canvases. One has active and one has hope written on it. Please feel free to contribute to that. These are two canvases that we're going to hang up in our Neutral Bay hub, and we would like to have your words of hope or active hope on there. But I know you're not here to listen to me, so without further ado, please welcome Zali.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you everyone for being out here. I'm just going to readjust a little bit. How's that for sound? Is that good? We're right. Okay. And we haven't quite coordinated our entries and everything properly, but just because they are currently waiting in the backdrops to introduction, I feel like I need to pull out our incredible panellists so that they can sit here as well, rather than being behind the screen. So first up, Greg Mullins, AO, AFSM. Former Commissioner of Fire and Rescue New South Wales, founder of the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action and councillor for the Climate Council. Julia Davis, Senior Policy and Communications Officer, Financial Rights Legal Service. And Emma Aisbett, Associate Professor, ANU College of Law, Governance and Policy. Okay, it feels much better now that I've got everyone out here on stage. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. This is a really important discussion. This is a first stage. It's a conversation and an issue we need to keep discussing a lot more and addressing. I do want to start by acknowledging the First Nations, First Australians, the Cammeraygal people of the Eora Nation here in this area of North Sydney, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathering today, and paying my respects to the elders past and present, but also paying my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are here with us, but also around the country. And I should say my understanding has increased so much since having the opportunity a little while ago to go up to visit the Torres Strait Islands and to understand the challenges, the remoteness and and just the situation they do find themselves in. For thousands of years, the Cammeraygal people have cared for this land, its waters, skies, biodiversity, in many ways cared for it much better than what we have in more recent history. And so as we meet to discuss climate action, we honour their enduring knowledge and stewardship of country and commit ourselves to learning from and working alongside First Nations peoples in caring for our shared future and for this incredible country. So we've got an incredible panel here tonight to talk about these issues, because you can't have the issue of climate action and mitigation, which is very much top of mind, without talking about the why. The why is the climate risk and the rapidly changing climate and how it's impacting our communities. Just recently, after a lot of pressure, the government released its National Climate Risk Assessment and Adaptation Plan. This was just a one-off assessment. We're not privy to the instructions or what are the underpinning assumptions that were sort of instructed to form the basis of it. But it was a fairly comprehensive, but there with some issues that we'll address today. But the National Climate Risk Assessment highlights the impact of climate change on our population, our geography, our communities, our way of life. It is all-encompassing. It will impact everyone. Now, of course, as soon as it came out, there was some criticisms of it being that it was alarmist. The reality is the climate risk assessment was pulling together the information for all of our key scientific agencies and putting all of those resources together. In fact, the area of our economy that has the most up-to-date data is in fact the insurance industry. They have the most precise risk assessments when it comes to climate impacts on our communities. But everyone contributed to that assessment, and we've landed with something that is incredibly dire. It's a hard read. The assessment warns that at 3 degrees of warming, and unfortunately, we are on track globally with the rate emissions and commitments are. We're on track to at least 2.7 degrees of warming at the moment. So under that type of scenario, so a scenario of 3 degrees of warming, Australia is a continent that will be heavily impacted. Up to four times the amount time spent in heat waves compared to what we experience now. And I think most of us would agree it's already changed quite a bit. Up to 5 times the amount of death due to extreme heat. So that is the most vulnerable in our community, elderly, that will not be coping with the situation. Up to $211 billion in productivity loss. So when the Treasurer convenes a productivity roundtable to talk about the future of the Australian economy, it really is pointless unless you address and talk about what are the biggest risk drivers to that productivity. And Australians do love their castles. We have a love affair with homes and houses, but the property values could take a $500 billion hit by 2050 due to the impact. Such an overwhelming proportion of the Australian population lives within the coast, lives within 50 kilometres of the coast, that climate impacts will have a dire impact and a really severe impact on our communities and way of life. We know the Australian government could spend almost 7 times more on disaster recovery by by 2090. When we talk about acknowledging First Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities will be impacted differently by climate change, including there will be more loss of country. As I said, the Torres Strait Islands was, it's incredibly low-lying islands. There will be an exacerbation of all underlying issues, especially existing health and social disparities driven by reduced air quality, extreme heat, interrupted health services, energy insecurity. So all in all, that National Climate Risk Assessment was a pretty sobering read. It provides much needed transparency for the risks to our community. And I think that transparency is incredibly important. I hope many of you are here because you appreciate the importance of that building social licence for change. It's about bringing everyone along for what needs to be done so that everyone understands the why. We can all agree to what needs to be done if we all agree on why we need to do it and what are the things we want to protect and safeguard. We need transparency for that to happen. That's why I've been pushing the government and recently introduced the National Adaptation Framework Bill to ensure that we have this type of risk assessment on a regular basis at arm's length of government every 5 years, with a mandated and legislated requirement for a national adaptation plan in response by the government, and then yearly updates to Parliament so that we can know that it's actually occurring. Currently, there's not really a national adaptation plan in response to the climate risk assessment. I've actually got a copy just there. It's a pretty thin read. The National Adaptation Plan is really an overview roadmap of where the government will start to address, but it's not a comprehensive response to the risks that we face. What the bill that I've tabled proposes is clear accountability mechanisms and independent evaluation of the implementation and then annual progress report. Because I think as communities, we deserve to know that this risk is being addressed. So it's really important. I'm not the expert here. We've got a lot of experts. We've got experts here on the stage. And I know many of you in registering have put in your questions, and so we'll address them, and then we'll take some more questions from the stage, from the audience. I'll take the microphones over. I think maybe a show of hands. Who's looked at the National Climate Risk Assessment that was released by the government recently? Okay, so we've got a pretty engaged audience here. And we're going to cover tonight on the why it matters and impacts so many of us. But I'm going to start with Greg. Now, Greg has an incredible amount of experience when it comes to dealing with emergencies. And too often we hear from community or politicians who say, Australia's a continent, we've always had floods, we've always had droughts, we've always had bushfires. She'll be right? That, you know, we've coped, we'll manage. I think it's really important to just take a step back and appreciate how that's changing and how that happens on the ground. So Greg, can you give us your perspective from your experience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Zali, and hello everybody. Thanks for coming along. Look, I've been fighting fires, responding to floods and other emergencies for over 50 years now. I'm back as a volunteer RFS firefighter, 40 years with Fire and Rescue, and I was a volunteer before that. I've worked in France, Spain, Canada, the US, and I've studied around the world. Now, in a nutshell, here, bushfires, which is my greatest area of expertise, from the 1994 fires. Who remembers the 1994 fires around here and went through them? They were pretty horrific. That blindsided me because never saw it coming, and I thought I could pick it. My dad was a lifetime volunteer firefighter. He said, I never saw that coming. And I started studying what went wrong and then found that Southern Europe had 1993 fires, Southern California had the Southern California firestorm. So I went and did a Churchill Fellowship and looked at it, but that's old news. And something called a flash drought happened in late 1993 and just dried things out really quickly. And it wasn't described in the science back then. It was 2000 before the first papers coming out saying, gee, it's getting really, really hot and you don't have to wait a year or 2 years for a drought to happen. It can happen in 6 weeks if it gets really hot and really dry with winds. So hold that thought. January 2003, Canberra lost 488 homes, 3 lives. The first fire tornado ever recorded worldwide, the fastest moving bushfire ever recorded worldwide. And it was a whole weather phenomena that took years for us to work out what actually happened, because the fire coupled with the stratosphere and created its own weather. And it was frightening to someone like me who thought I had this nailed. I know about this stuff. Black Saturday 2009 in Victoria, 173 people lost their lives. And I won't go into the details of why that was so different, but the hottest, we had to change the fire danger rating system in Australia and add catastrophic, because since 1939, massive fires, we'd said, no, bushfires are survivable, and if you're prepared, you should stay and look after your home because you will save it, because the figures show that. After 2009, we realised no, on the worst days when those fires couple with the stratosphere and cause a firestorm, a literal firestorm, it's not survivable. People have to get out. And then we had our Black Summer fires, and So just to put that into perspective, more than 1,000% increase in property losses over the worst previous fires in New South Wales, which were in 2013. And that's a whole other story, 6 weeks earlier than we'd ever had before, and no El Nino. So look, bottom line, the weather's changed. We're getting massive urban conflagrations, Lahaina in Maui, Colorado in 2021, Los Angeles, where I worked for months and know very well, and know the fire chief from Los Angeles County. The most homes that ever lost there was about 1,200, and they lost 18,000 in winter when they've never had fires before, because the winds were just so extreme. Quick flip to floods, very simple science. For every 1 degree increase in temperature, the atmosphere holds 7% more water vapour. And for hourly rates of rain in Sydney, it's up to 23% greater than it used to be. So you get flash floods, and you get riverine flooding like Lismore, 2 metres over the historic high, stuff we've never seen before. And that's the trajectory. I won't go on because we've got limited time, but fires burn overnight now like they used to during the day. So that's when we used to control fires, and we often can't backburn at night now. It's taking away our traditional tools. And the big ticket item, the only way that the human race can actually address this and moderate it over time is to cut out pollution from the burning of coal, oil and gas, because we know that's what's driving the changes in our weather.
So, Greg, just... It was pretty sobering and shocking watching the images of the LA fires last year. It was last year. Sorry, I've lost track of time.
Yeah, January this year.
Yeah. And often there's a sense of disconnect where, especially urban communities, are feeling that maybe it can't happen here. Is it your sense, in fact, that the National Risk Assessment identifies that all coastal communities, all communities are actually at risk of different types of exacerbated events?
Yes. So, look, one of the fundamental, my contention, informed by climate scientists who have looked at this, is that it's way undercooked, the National Risk Assessment. Some people are saying it's scary and, you know, they shouldn't have said this, it's scaring people. Well, it's a wake-up call. Do we want to go there? No. And it's a bit like saying we've got an enemy somewhere, we better buy nuclear submarines and missiles and get ready just in case. But something that we know could annihilate us, let's kick the can down the road for some other poor person to pick up. We can't do that. Sorry, back to the question. Can it happen here? The underlying thing is wind. Wind velocities are getting much stronger. Ask the insurance industry, they know. They've detailed it for the last 40 years, and they've got the graphs to show why storm damage is getting worse and why the payouts are getting more. So in Los Angeles, they had 160 kilometre per hour winds gusting to about 190. Firefighters were getting knocked over in the street and bowled down the road. Their water streams from great big 70 millimetre hoses were just turning into spray back on them. They couldn't, so all they did was rescue people. And, you know, this whole thing about, the water ran out and everything. Of course it did. Runs out here too when you have a big fire. But you can't fight fires in weather conditions like that because, you're getting extreme temperatures. As we got in Black Summer, I was fighting fires on a 49 degree day and ended up with severe dehydration in bed for 2 days. But the winds, if you get that on a cold day, the Colorado fire that wiped out 2,000 homes in 2021, it snowed the next day. It only got up to 8 degrees that day. But the gale force winds and dry landscape. So to the turn of the century, I can't imagine what firefighters will be facing by then, because we know through modelling that by 2040, the Black Summer weather, which up till then was the hottest, driest year ever, will be an average summer from 2040. From 2060, it will be an exceedingly cool one. That's peer-reviewed, solid science. So if we don't do something. So we must.
Thank you. So, Julia, we know that one of the direct consequences of this, and Greg's touched on it, is insurance. And I've surveyed and we've door-knocked in the community, and we know insurance premiums are going up really, really fast. We now know probably about 1 in 5 homes are underinsured or uninsured. Premiums on average around the country rose by 32% from 2022 to 2024. In some areas, and I suspect some of you in the room, 100 to 150% increases to insurance premiums, and then certain areas of insurance simply not being available. You simply cannot cover yourself for some risk. Now, the insurance sector is also a profit-making insurance sector, and there is definitely some questions around the customer service, making sure claims are paid, making sure it is price competitive, and so I want to touch on that. But when we talk cost of living and impacts and the impacts of climate, these are not impacts we're going to pay for in the future. They are impacts we are paying for now, every year, through insurance premiums, through other aspects of our daily budgets that are going up. So, Julia, you are absolutely on the front line of helping Australians and people within our community that are finding that are really experiencing the challenge of those costs becoming just simply unmanageable.
Yeah, I am. So, hello, thanks for having me. I work at the Financial Rights Legal Centre. We're a not-for-profit community legal centre based in Sydney, but we operate a number of national assistance lines. So one is the National Debt Helpline, and another is we have a National Insurance Law Service. And so we take calls from Australians all over and give them free legal advice when they have problems with their insurer or have a dispute or have questions. We take between 100 and 150 insurance calls a week. So we talk to a lot of people who are struggling with insurance premiums going up. And more we are getting calls from people who are frustrated. They don't understand why their premium has gone up so much. It's gone up 20, 30, 40, 50%. It's doubled, well above inflation. It's very frustrating for people, A, because they don't understand it. There's not a lot of transparency from the insurance industry when it comes to how your prices are set. But also, it's often people who've been with the same insurer for 20, 30 years. They've maybe never made a claim. They don't consider themselves to be in a high-risk area. They certainly haven't ever claimed after a natural disaster. And still, their insurance premiums are going up and up and up. And it really puts pressure on the budget. We certainly know of a lot of people, and we know from modelling that there are just probably millions of Australians now going underinsured, if not completely uninsured, because they simply can't afford those increases. And things that people that we talk to don't always understand is your mortgage requires you to have adequate insurance. So in areas like the Northern Rivers, where if you want full cover and flood cover, it's going to cost you $30,000 a year. People often opt out of the flood cover. They're in breach of their mortgage contract. That is not considered adequate insurance. We know under the law that all strata buildings in New South Wales have to have adequate insurance cover. So it is simply not an option for owners' corporations to underinsure or not have insurance. The interconnectedness of our financial system was a little bit in the climate assessment, and it's quite sobering. A huge amount of the investments the super funds have in Australia are in residential housing, right? Almost all small business lending is based on residential property as collateral, right? So as more and more homes become uninsurable, or it's very expensive to insure them, and homeowners can't adequately insure them, not only is their home at risk, but our entire economy is at risk, right? It is all interconnected. What is critical is that we need to ensure that home insurance, strata insurance remains accessible and affordable for everybody. Otherwise, we will start to see what's called the protection gap grow and grow and grow. And that's the gap between, people who are insured and are covered and those who are not. And the more that it grows, the greater our economy is at risk, but also those individual homeowners are the ones carrying all the risk, right? I find it a bit frustrating because, yes, I agree, it's an industry that needs to make money, and we want them to exist and we want them to be sustainable. We've seen insurance markets start to collapse in places like California and Florida. We want it to sustain. But the truth is, they're not carrying the risk the way we are. They have reinsurance when there's years of lots and lots of disasters, and they have capital reserves for after that. So I think that there needs to be a big conversation around who should be carrying all of this risk. Is it just us, or should it be also the industry that is making record profits? Should it also be the government that knows where the hotspots are, that knows where the underinsurance is taking place?
And obviously from that perspective, it's also bringing everyone to the table around how do we mitigate the risk. So on one hand, we have industries that are putting fuel on the fire by continuing emissions and making all these risks worse. We have government sitting on the fence, I would argue, in terms of what actions they're taking. We have a sector like the insurance industry that they will ultimately focus on their profits and won't carry that risk. But communities carry the risk. But knowing that we can't insure our way out of the climate crisis, insurance will not solve this. And so we all need to come to the table to really think about how much do we have tied into this risk assessment and why it's so important that we talk about it. Because this is the why. When we talk about the cost of transition, the cost of mitigation and acting on climate change, this is your why, because the consequences on the other side of the ledger are significant. So I'll go to Emma at that point, talking about the broader economic consequences. We know from floods and bushfires that Greg has touched on, it's currently about $38 billion to the budget from disaster recovery. And our metrics is completely wrong at the moment. The government only invests about 13% of our disaster recovery and relief in any kind of resilience building. Yet the information that we know from economists that for every $1 you invest in resilience and adaptation, you save $11 on disaster recovery. So that $38 billion that we're facing at the moment from disaster relief, and that's really only... It's a little bit of lost productivity, it's the disaster payouts to homeowners, to communities. It doesn't, I think the cost of ex-cyclone Alfred during the election was, for 1 week of disruption, was something like $13 billion. So Emma, what's the economic outlook for us from this risk assessment?
Yeah, thank you, Zali. And I tell you what, these guys are hard acts to follow. Talking about billions of dollars doesn't really have the same sort of resonance as some of Greg's stories. But and indeed, I was going to talk about, isn't it horrible when a cyclone wipes out the mango crop and they're really expensive? The fact is, though, that all of this stuff does feed through, right? So obviously, agriculture and fisheries are some of the, most impacted areas, and that means that our cost of living goes up. This is the food that we're putting on the table, and it's not just Australia. Australia is a big exporter, but it's globally, wheat crops around the world, supply chains, and this makes everyone's cost of living go up. The disasters in towns, and this links back to the insurance, right? So there's very good research that shows if the towns are sort of generally underinsured, they don't bounce back, because unless you get the money back into these economies, they just can't recover. So then the underinsurance compounds the sort of, the multiplier effects that we all know operate in the economy. You've already alluded, Zali, to the implications for the government's balance sheet. If you've got a shrinking economy and the risk assessment talks about sort of a 4% lower GDP as a result of $211 billion. I agree with Greg. I think they're actually underestimates, conservative estimates. So you've got a smaller revenue stream for the government at the same time as they need to increase their payouts to try to compensate for disasters, to help deal with risk. And of course, ultimately, government will have to step in because, as Julia said, and as you said, Zali, you can't insure your way out of systemic risk, and climate change is a systemic risk. So risk sharing only works if those risks are rare. We all pool our premiums together, and if we're the unlucky one, the money from everyone comes to save us. That doesn't work if we're all the unlucky ones. So huge impacts in all parts of the economies, but also it has to be said that some people will suffer more than others. Some communities will suffer. People who work outdoors will suffer. They'll suffer from health impacts. They'll suffer from lost incomes because there will just be an increasing number of days where they cannot do their job. It is too hot. The storm, the wind is too intense. You can't be up on that rooftop installing the solar panels or whatever else you're doing. And ironically, a lot of the economies that are likely to be most affected are outside of the metropolitan areas in agriculture, fisheries. Are ironically some of those who are most reluctant for the net zero transition. I think that's a real paradox.
So maybe we can expand on that a little bit, that economic outlook, because those wanting to hold back transition are generally arguing about the cost of transition without ever genuinely acknowledging the cost of inaction or failing to meet the challenge of the transition. From an economist's point of view, when you read the National Climate Risk Assessment, do you feel it genuinely reflects the economic challenge that we have ahead of us? And for example, the Treasurer just held the Economic Roundtable. Resilience was not at the table. The insurance industry was not invited. I tried to get resilience there. We didn't get much. The only focus is on economic opportunity, and we're going to get to that. There is some good news. The opportunity of new markets, but not much acknowledgement of, unless we underpin what we already have, productivity really can't improve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few basic resources on which productivity hangs. There's the human resources, which we know will suffer from climate impacts and from the sort of mental strain of it as well. And there's the natural resources that will suffer as well. So it is very hard to see how the Treasurer wants to boost productivity if we're not addressing mitigation to reduce these negative impacts, as well as you've pointed out, that adaptation piece. So we can't insure our way out of this, but we can ameliorate, some of the bad impacts through smart policies like some of the ones we proposed in our re-energised economy, about supporting people to make choices for their businesses and for their homes that will make them more resilient in the face of, what is the baked-in climate change.
Okay, so it's not going to be all bad news tonight. What do you feel needs to happen at a policy level, and what's happening overseas? Greg, maybe from I think first and fundamentally we worry about physical safety. So from an emergency response aspect, we rely heavily on volunteerism is a huge part of that. In New South Wales, what sort of resources do we have ready to deal with fires, floods and other emergencies? Do we have enough for what we face now and will face in the future? And how many of them are, because they are volunteers, how do you think we are going to cope with that as communities, and with longer fire seasons, more frequent floods, more destruction? How is that sustainable?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Well, look, who's out there helping us? Australia-wide, there's about 320,000 emergency responders, and they're mainly volunteer rural fire services, SES, but you also have the fire and rescue services, are full-time and on call in country areas. In New South Wales, we've got New South Wales Rural Fire Service, probably about 40,000 active volunteers and a couple of thousand brigades. Fire and Rescue New South Wales, my old agency that I used to head up, that's about 340 communities, about 7,000 volunteers, but importantly, they've also got 6,000 community fire unit volunteers. Are there any here? Any community? Yay, blue overalls. Go team. Oh, sorry. And that's a resilience thing that we did after 1994, so self-help. You've got the State Emergency Service, probably about 12,000 people. Is there enough? No. So in the climate risk assessment, it talked about, can I get the 3 Cs? Consecutive, compounding...
Cascading.
And cascading, thank you. And what does that mean, consecutive? We went from Black Summer fires. The Black Summer fires got put out by flooding rains. And then we had triple La Nina event, very rare, 3 years of La Nina, so wetter than average. We had the massive floods we had record floods in 2020, 2021, 2022, then again in 2025. Wet. And we saw in Lismore the Tinny Flotilla. Locals had to rescue their community members off the reef because the SES was totally overwhelmed. And a lot of people blamed the volunteers in the ERFS who were probably swimming out of their own homes to go and help other people. Well, I know they were, and I know individuals who were. But, and this is what we're finding, Black Summer, we used to share resources between states, but that year every state and territory burnt at the same time. It used to be consecutive from north to south. Queensland's season would finish, New South Wales and then Victoria, and we'd share aircraft, people, trucks. We couldn't in Black Summer because everything burned at once. So this is what the climate risk assessment shows. That's going to get worse. You can't have enough. And at the same time, you've had the Defence Strategic Review saying, hello, you keep wanting the green machine to go out and work in disasters. Firstly, tanks aren't very good at putting out fires. They can try and blow them up, but we're not trained. Yes, we can help clean up, but hey, if someone comes knocking on our door externally, that's actually our job, not in here. It's saying we've got to cycle out. But just as things are getting worse, and we have to call on Defence more and more to back up volunteers who sometimes say, you know what, I've been doing this for 3 months, my business is gone or I've been sacked from my job, I can't do it anymore. They're saying, well, we can't. We've got an increasing geopolitical threat environment and we've got to look outwards. So it's, and again, back to adaptation and that $2 to $11 benefit for every dollar that you invest in moving homes off floodplains, retrofitting homes to meet Australian Standard 3959, building in bushfire-prone areas, getting community groups together who work out their risk and work out what they're going to do, where will we evacuate to, who do we need to look after. They're the things that make a huge difference and drive down those recovery costs. 87% spent on response and recovery, and only 13% on getting ready. It's nuts. It's back to front. And Zali's been pushing this so hard. And Zali, you know more about it than me. I know I've studied it for 40 years. You're so clever. Well, I hate that. But no, it's great.
Lots of experts come knocking on my door. Obviously, looking ahead, Julia, in terms of, a big concern for everybody is that cost aspect. What policy changes do you think are needed to ensure fair and affordable insurance access in the face of climate impacts?
So we know that across the board, insurance really is just a reflection of risk. Now, you can squabble about how much of it is recouping profits after a lean year or, what have you, but it should be a reflection of risk. And the only way really to bring down insurance prices in a sustainable way is to reduce the risk, which means resilience measures, which means adaptation, which means better, safer homes that are going to be more resilient to bushfire or going to be higher off the ground to flood. In the long run, that is the best way to reduce insurance prices. Now, who pays for that, right? It's not an easy thing to do to raise your house, 14 meters above the flood levels in Lismore. So I think it's a complicated problem. There's no easy silver bullet solution here. Some of it has to be homeowners investing in the resilience of their own homes. It is something that we can and should be empowered to do. Making sure that the drainage on our property is as good as it can be so that the water doesn't come in at all when we have heavy, heavy rains and flash flooding. Making sure that we have the most, if we're in a flood area, things like tile floors, much easier to clean up after a flood than wood floors or carpets. Making sure your power points are halfway up the wall and not right down at the baseboards. There are a lot of little things we can do, but the big things cost a lot of money. And so there need to be some really creative solutions where government, banks, insurers, investors get involved and come up with innovative products and make sure that we're coming together, because somebody who has paid off their mortgage, is on a fixed income, on a pension, the banks aren't going to lend them $60,000 to raise their house up, right? So how do we solve that problem? They might have a ton of equity in their house. How can we access some of that equity and give them the cash to make their home more resilient so it lasts for the long run, and then maybe get a caveat on the end of that loan so that you don't have to pay it back until you sell the property? There's a lot of creative solutions being bounced around out there, but really what I would love is for us to start talking about home insurance and strata insurance as an essential service. The same way we talk about other essential services. You should have access to energy. You should have access to healthcare. You should have access, to the internet. These are essential services. And in a country where we know that about 75% on average of our wealth is wrapped up in our one single asset, in our home, it is essential that that is protected. Why in the world are we expecting people to go out into regional areas where they grow all the food for the rest of us and have to carry all the burden of the rising insurance prices? That should be an essential service. If we want thriving regional communities, people need to have access to insurance. And if they can't afford it, we need to figure out how to put them on concession schemes or reduce the tax burden. There are lots of levers that government can pull when it comes to an essential service. It's why we all have access to pretty great health care in Australia. So it's time to stop talking about insurance like a luxury item, like an add-on.
Nice to have.
A nice to have. No, it is an essential product that we all need access to, because probably most of you, your livelihoods, your retirement, your entire wealth plan is wrapped up in your homes, in this asset that you own. If you can't protect it, that is your entire plan. What happens? So I think it's time for us to start treating insurance like an essential service. We probably should be removing GST from it. That feels like a no-brainer. There are a lot of really simple things. And in New South Wales, finally, the New South Wales government has agreed to remove the emergency services levy off of insurance. This is a much more equitable way to pay for emergency services. It shouldn't just be the homes that are insured that pay for it. It should be everybody pays their fair share for emergency services. So that's happening, which hopefully will reduce prices in New South Wales by about 10 to 15%. But that's not that helpful if your insurance costs $20,000 a year. So it's just the beginning, but there are a lot of solutions and a lot of very smart people out there discussing them, but it is not something that the market can solve. And it's not something that we should have to solve. It is something that the private industry needs to come together and be innovative and come up with creative solutions, and government needs to incentivize that work.
And can we touch on renters? Because obviously there's a heavy focus of homeowners, and you touched on strata as well. But this applies for renters. Renters may not have home contents insurance. And so when a flood occurs, they are also losing everything.
Yeah, absolutely. For renters, having contents cover is really important, and unfortunately, a lot of them, probably more than half of them, don't have it, especially young people who are like, what could possibly go wrong? They don't appreciate that it's not just your couch you need to replace, it's all of your white goods, it's your refrigerator that breaks, it's all of your technology. So contents cover is important, and if it's out of reach financially, there are things you can do. You can increase your excess, you can reduce your sum insured to just what you really need to carry on. When it comes to extreme weather, I think most people don't know this, but landlord insurance can and should, in my opinion, always have temporary accommodation cover for your tenants, right? So what happens after a major disaster like the floods in Lismore is tenants just go. They just abandon town. They're like, there's nothing here for me. I've lost all my stuff. There's no places for me to go. My landlord says the house is uninhabitable, and they just go. That is not what you should do. You should get some tenancy advice. You have rights as a tenant. Your landlord has an obligation to, if the home becomes uninhabitable, to make sure that you've got temporary accommodation. If that's not possible in situations like Lismore where there just wasn't any housing, you certainly shouldn't be paying rent on your uninhabitable home. So there are rights. You are, under the Insurance Contracts Act, considered a third-party beneficiary. I know that got very legal, but tenants have rights. And if something happens that makes their home uninhabitable, they should be getting in touch with a free tenancy service and get some advice. And if they have a good relationship with the landlord, which I hope a lot of people do, they can ask the landlord, who is your landlord insurance? Who's your provider? Do you have temporary accommodation cover for me? If you're not going to make a claim, can I call them? Because you should be able to make a claim as a third-party beneficiary. So tenants do have some power. Unfortunately, they don't have a lot of power when it comes to adaptation and mitigation and paying to make the home more resilient. This is where we see a real disconnect with tenants who pay for the energy but then have no ability to put solar panels on the house, kind of a thing.
Okay. So Emma, if we can zoom back out to, I guess, we've talked a lot about the economic downsides of the risks of where we're heading from a micro and a macro point of view. The economic benefits of transition. What are you seeing as an economist? Have we missed the boat to take advantage of the transition? How are we competitive in global markets? What are really our opportunities?
Yeah, lucky me. I get to sort of start taking us up the other side of the J-curve. And yes, Australia does have opportunities. So are we maximising those opportunities? Is our climate target in line with climate science and sort of maximising our benefit to cost ratio? No, it's too low for that. But have we missed the boat internationally? Sadly not, because we're not the only ones who are acting way too slow. Having said that, there's some areas in which Australia is world leading, rooftop solar. In terms of readiness for virtual power plants, we've been ranked number 1 in the world. In terms of sort of the industry transition, the industrial transition, obviously China is way out in front. Like it built its own speedboat and just kind of took off. But it's thanks to China's investments that have gone on for decades, of course, that solar panels are so cheap, that batteries are so cheap, so that we can do all the things that we are doing here in Australia. And we can sort of really build on that using the cheap renewable energy where the hardware might come from somewhere else. But Australia, of course, has fantastic natural resources. We have a lot of fossil fuel resources, which has been one of the sort of political impediments, obviously. But we have fantastic renewable energy resources, as we know. We've got a lot of land, a lot of sun, and a lot of wind, sometimes too much wind. So we are definitely, competitive not only sort of for small things, but to really play a very important role in helping to decarbonise the global economy, and certainly that in our region. So, of course, Australia's biggest emissions impact aren't really from our domestic activities, it's from the fossil fuels that we export. And if we could turn that around, our research has showed that we can go from contributing about 9% of Asia's emissions from the coal and the use of the iron ore that we currently export, to instead supplying them with things like green iron. So, taking our own iron ore, reducing it potentially up in the northwest of Australia, where we have incredible solar and wind resources as well. And so playing a part in global value chains, helping our trading partners to decarbonise, and of course, moving ourselves up the value chain so that we're just not digging up our country and exporting it at low price. So yes, there is a lot of opportunity for Australia, but we need to really keep our eyes on the prize. We need to not... I see some of the industry that I interact with sort of very tempted to be like, well, we could make genuinely green iron, or we could make sort of conventional iron and buy a whole lot of offsets, and maybe we should try and get the policies to make that look like that's green iron. And I say very strongly to them, great, if you want to ensure that you lose your comparative advantage, great idea, because the Japanese can also do that. They, in fact, have already a whole lot of steel-making capability, conventional steel-making capability. So if you want to call green steel that which is conventional steel plus offsets, they will beat us. Australia's real opportunity is in genuinely clean and green products, and that's what we need to focus on.
So, in a re-energised economy, in the paper, we explored some of the policy areas and levers available, in fact, to help that transition. So there is an upfront cost to the transition, but the economic payout is substantial, and the more efficiently we get over that transition hump, the better. Do you want to maybe explain a bit where you see are those key opportunities, and do you think we're currently grasping them?
Thanks, Zali, and I thanks for also really highlighting something that we do try and highlight in the re-energised economy that I think doesn't get enough airplay in the government reports of the Productivity Commission's latest report, and that is, we're currently at a very high cost society, cost of living financially and environmentally high cost society, and because renewable energy, and thanks to China, is so cheap. We have this opportunity to get to this low-cost society, right? So it's not that we have to move to somewhere where it was traditionally the narrative that, it's going to be so expensive having, a clean economy. That is no longer the case. But what does remain true is that transition is costly, exactly as you said, Zali. So we've got to try and get over that hump. The sort of current government approach is pretty much, okay, there's a pretty big hump, let's throw some money at it, let's throw some money at billionaires. That's one way of doing it, not necessarily the most efficient way of doing it. In re-energised economy, we tried to imagine a few different ways, and my first degree was chemical engineering, so I went straight to, let's lower the activation energy by smarter ideas, let's tunnel through and use smart regulation, and we've talked about some of the ways that could really help to unlock, especially for households and small businesses. I think something that is being untapped currently is the enormous, I know I have so many friends who are in small business who have all these great ideas about how to decarbonise their businesses or how to set up businesses that would help other people decarbonise. And what we really need to do is invest and empower in Australian ideas, in our innovation, because we love trying to solve problems and figure out ways to do things. It's kind of part of the Australian ethos. So I think a little more investment and support for our ideas, and maybe a little less for sort of big, flashy projects. Those big projects have to happen. We do need to move at scale as well. But one of the things that we highlight in the re-energised economy is, but maybe the subsidies that we hand those billionaires, maybe they should pay something back from that when they're successful. And ultimately, not all of them will be successful, but some will. So there are different ways. My colleague Bruce Chapman, inventor of HEX, we can also apply contingent loans to things like green industrial policy. Or the government, instead of just handing out subsidies, can co-invest. We, can diversify away from just, all our superannuation or our government funds are relying on home values into investing in a new clean economy.
Absolutely. So we had some, I want to get some, I'm mindful of time and I want to get some questions. So Gerald from Neutral Bay asked about there's been talk about the introduction of a road tax on electric vehicle owners. My view on it, is there a better alternative by abolishing the current fuel tax and broadening the tax to better represent the actual costs of road maintenance? Well, that's a big one. Right, there is that discussion of introducing a road user tax. Now, traditionally, the fuel excise, which everyone pays when they go to the petrol pump, is theoretically going to road maintenance. Reality is it goes into general revenue. It is not applied to road maintenance. So we've got to sort of, call that one out straight away. We also know that there are very generous subsidies that are getting pulled out of that general revenue, for example, for mining and for transport and for agriculture. I don't have as big an issue with agriculture, but mining and transport, I do. And because that the diesel fuel excise rebate that those sectors are getting is growing exponentially. And so when the Treasurer talks of introducing a road user charge to make up for the lost revenue because of a budget constraint, it's being fairly disingenuous as to where the constraint is genuinely coming from, and that is the really growing diesel fuel excise rebate that mining and transport has been. It has been growing exponentially, at a much greater rate than was ever contemplated when it was introduced. I have no issue with a road user charge if it's one that's comprehensive, that should apply to all road users. Let's scrap the fuel excise and actually have a road user charge that is comprehensive, that reflects the size of a vehicle, the impact of a vehicle on the roads, the emissions of a vehicle. I think then we can actually genuinely have an equitable system. I mean, at the moment, what the government is proposing is a tinker around the edges of trying to change it to address or blame a revenue problem on electric vehicle drivers. Electric vehicle drivers are about 2% of road users in Australia. So if there's a revenue issue, it's not coming from electric vehicle drivers. In fact, I think we're still only around the 10 to 12% of new vehicle sales are electric vehicles. So we have a long way to go before you can blame lack of revenue on electric vehicle drivers. So I think, again, it's maybe symptomatic of this government is rather than genuinely tackling the problem front on, looking at it properly, the full extent, it's trying to tack on a solution or something to the edges without addressing the overwhelming problem. But Emma, what are your thoughts on a road user charge?
Look, I think the reality is, so if you look at OECD reports on carbon pricing around the world, Australia looks okay because they count our fuel excise as essentially a carbon tax, which is lucky, yeah. It's one of the best carbon taxes we have. So the reality is that's the way it's operating, and that's what we need more of. We need, how do we fund the transition? How do we fund adaptation? How do we get the government's budget in line so we can bail people out who've been flooded? By stopping subsidising fossil fuels. And so rolling back one of the very few taxes that we do have on emissions in this country, I think would be very problematic unless we're willing to say, actually, that's what it was doing. So yes, we can swap, we can have a road user charge, but as you said, that road user charge or something else needs to go back on, and it needs to be have the loopholes of the diesel excise rebate plugged to the tune of about $10 billion, I think the Australia Institute has estimated. So these are big numbers.
The amount of the diesel fuel rebate to mining is growing. It actually is acting as a disincentive to decarbonise and electrify transport within the mining sector because they make money out of the diesel fuel excise as opposed to the price of offsets. That's how crazy that system is. Now, Meredith from French's Forest. How can we allow consumers with excess solar power stored in batteries to sell the excess to the local community rather than being limited to VPNs managed by large energy suppliers? It's a very technical question. I think, again, this comes back to our regulatory changes that are required. So at the moment, we have a system that's not dynamic, that's not adapting to a changing environment, and the rapid uptake we're now seeing of batteries. We need to look at how do we create a better model between the solar that is generated on homes, the storage capacity within electric vehicles. We need to get to vehicle-to-grid charging and capacity. That will help a lot from a grid supply point of view. But it is a little bit what you were talking about before, is that question of more dynamic and flexible regulatory environment that can allow households, small businesses to play their part and to participate in that transition.
Yeah, Zali, I mean, I think it's such a huge opportunity for households, for communities, and for the price of energy or electricity specifically. But it is, you're absolutely right, we need to make sure that a few sort of oligopoly electricity market players don't start controlling all of those assets, all of those, many millions and millions of dollars that Australian homeowners have invested. And so it's a little bit of a cliched economist answer to say we need to get the regulatory setup right to prevent those sort of oligopoly market situations. If we do have enough competition and small players in the ACT, we've got Reposit, which was set up by a colleague of mine, Lachlan Blackall, it is possible that there can be win-wins. There can be small, innovative businesses who are helping households to play in this market without exploiting them. But we need the regulatory setup right. We need information clear and available so that people don't sort of not even realise that they do have options outside the big players.
Okay. Julie?
Oh, no, I feel like you handled it.
Opportunities open. Now, Brian from Mossman, would less logging in Australian native forests reduce climate warming and fire risks? Now, yes.
Yes.
Greg? Quick answer.
So, look, if you want to look at a bit of research here, Professor David Lindenmayer and Dr. Phil Zylstra have done a lot of research into native forest logging and fire risk. And the bottom line is, when you log an area, the canopy's reduced, it dries out and becomes more fire prone for about 30 years. And if you let it go longer than 30 years, the fire risk then just goes, underneath the understory changes, becomes less flammable. Anyway, there's a whole lot of physical processes happen, but the answer is yes. And big trees sequester carbon. They suck in carbon for part of photosynthesis and to make their energy. And so big trees are good, little trees are not so good. So it's we really need to be planting lots and lots of trees. Talk about new technologies, there's lots of talk about we have to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. That got worked out by Adam and Eve. It was, it was a long time ago, but we just started cutting them down because it seemed like a good idea at the time. It was a crap idea. Sorry.
So yes, obviously the irony for example, the gas industry talks about carbon capture and storage in very complex, incredibly expensive ways, and Emma, we know they are economically not working. It's not unviable. It's not achieving the results. The cheapest form of carbon capture and storage that we have are native forests.
Oh, yeah, well, is it Santos? They got billions, and was it Santos up in the northwest shelf? And anyway, billions and billions sound like Trump. Oh no, don't say that. Billions and billions of our dollars to try and suck carbon down and put it in underground, and it just kept leaking out again, and it didn't work. But we're still paying them, and it was so that they could still sell our gas to other countries at huge profit and bring us from number 15 emitter in the world to number 5 when Scope 3 emissions. So we're dirty and we pay people to make us dirty, and we're not getting that in the emergency services, any of that money, green steel, anything else. We're paying them to screw us. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have, another slightly technical question. And where's the microphone if we're going to go to the room for some questions? There's a question, Andrew, from North Sydney around a bill to cap diesel fuel rebate at 20 million per annum. That wouldn't affect farmers, small business or transport, but would provide an incentive for large miners to transition to green fuels and electrification. It's something to look at. I think we need to transition away from the diesel fuel rebate for mining, full stop. I don't even know why. Why should it continue if there is technology and other opportunities? So I think there is a really big. There's a lot of debate around this. Should we incentivise them by paying them to transition versus requiring a fair contribution? I think that's the jury's a little bit out on that. I tend to feel that they've been benefiting from public funding and subsidies for quite a long time already, when the cost of risk and assessment and transition is escalating, and we need to address that. Now, I want to make sure, any hands up for any questions from the floor around climate risk and resilience. If you could, I will just make a point of maybe introduce yourself, keep it short and make it a question, not a statement, if I may.
This is for Greg. What's the probability of the next, or what's the timing of the next Black Summer bushfire season? What's the probability of that happening in the next 10 years?
Look, thanks for the question. I hate to say this because my wife always tells me, "Oh, you're so depressing when you speak." But I think she means it functions like this. But look, unfortunately, it's almost certain. Now, what's happened to fire frequency in New South Wales, Sydney Basin, this century and last century? We used to get big fires about every 10 to 13 years. Until 1994. And then we got big fires in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2006, 2013, and then 2019-20. So it's down to average about 5 or 6 years. Every 5 or 6 years, those serious weather conditions come back, and probably every third bad season will be a horrendous season. That's what climate scientists are saying. So in the next 10 years, it's very likely we will get a bad fire season. I didn't actually answer Zali's earlier question about Los Angeles. Could it happen here? I think that was the basis. The answer is yeah. We missed Black Summer in the Sydney Basin. We were really lucky, but yet we had more homes destroyed than ever before, but in regional areas, 2,476 homes. And thousands of other buildings like schools, sawmills, shops. So we know that it will happen. We know, unfortunately, we'll have a Los Angeles-like event. Canberra and Black Saturday in Victoria were mini Los Angeles, and with extreme winds, it will happen. Perth Hills, Dandenongs, Adelaide Hills, Hobart, Sunshine Coast, Blue Mountains, Sydney, the Illawarra Escarpment, they're all incredibly fire prone, and the fuel levels are going up because we haven't been able to burn for 5 years because it's been so wet. So sorry to be so depressing, but we will get those big fires back, which is why we must invest in resilience and getting ahead of the game. And we can.
Hello, David McEwen here. Just got a question on property values and the impact of property values. And we talked a little bit about Lismore. Obviously, close to home, we've got the example of higher-end properties at Collaroy. what needs to happen to make sure that councils aren't, continuing to approve developments in increasingly exposed land, and what's the best way to manage the valuation impacts to existing properties of making those changes?
Okay, well, the difficulty is we're actually at the moment, there's a bit of a regime change. A lot of approvals are being taken out of the hands of local government. Some of the legislative changes from a planning point of view from state government are essentially bypassing local government in that decision making. In fact, locally, there is the proposal is to bypass bushfire the RFS warnings around construction. It's believed it's a bit of a lizard rock provision, but essentially the state government is proposing to pass legislation that bypasses objections of bushfire risk around development. So that's how nonsensical it gets. Local government, I think, have a problem as well. So we talked a little bit about the emergency levy no longer being on insurances, but it gets passed on to local government. Local government are passing it on to communities through your rates and the increase in rates. That ultimately communities are paying for it. How we build and where we build really matters. And we have to build smart from now on, because we've got a huge amount of housing stock that needs to be retrofitted, and maybe Julia can touch on that a little bit. But what we build from now needs to be climate resilient. Yet the government, with its supermajority, one of its announcements coming out of the productivity roundtable was to freeze for 4 years any progress to the building code on the basis of being able to accelerate approvals. Now, it's a really short-term fix. Getting a higher rate of faster approvals is not of any assistance if ultimately construction doesn't occur at pace, but also if they are not climate resilient and appropriate houses for the long term. The cheapest house is always the house that you build once. It's not the one you have to build again. So I think the interaction between local government, state and federal is really important when it comes to planning and housing. What we build, where we build really matters. And we have to be a lot more upfront about the risk profile. So building on floodplains just can't happen. Building in bushfire-prone areas, again, has to be addressed, because if not, these properties are uninsurable for the number one risk they're exposed to, and if they're uninsurable, they're unlendable. They don't hold value, and so we, as we've discussed, everything underpinning that economic viability is in question. In terms of, I just wanted to touch, Julia, a little bit on the concern is all too often the risk is borne by those that least understand it or least able to deal with it when it comes to housing affordability. And I think, and we do get back to tenants who end up in housing that is in flood-prone or bushfire-prone areas or poorly built for the conditions.
Yeah, I wish I had a magic solution. We have a huge legacy problem in Australia of homes that have been built in high-risk areas, and a growing problem of homes that weren't in high-risk areas but are now becoming high-risk areas. And so you're right, and you're not alone in shouting from the rooftops that, like, we have to stop doing it. That's only the beginning, is to just stop building more things in risky areas. Because the cost of retrofitting and the cost of relocation and the cost of buybacks is astronomical. And we have not wrapped our head around how we're going to do that. And it is true that the lowest resilient group of people who have the lowest income are pushed into the least resilient housing in the highest risk areas. They have no capacity to retrofit those homes, no capacity to pay for upgrades. And they are the ones who are in the riskiest areas. And we just have an absolute ton of people who have lived in a home their entire life. They have paid off the mortgage. They are on a fixed income. and it is their one and only asset, and their entire retirement is wrapped around it, and it is just on the brink of being destroyed by an extreme weather event. And what do we do with those homes? It's not equitable to say like, oh, well, they just shouldn't live there. What? They've lived there their whole life. Probably their grandfather built the house and we approved it. We let it happen. We've let developments grow in these risky areas for generations. I think we have a societal obligation to support those people. But when it comes to new stuff, no way. We've got to put our foot down. It is crazy that we are still building stuff in floodplains. It's crazy that there isn't anything mandatory in vendor documents saying what the next 50 years is going to look like for that property and what insurance is going to cost. It's crazy that insurance is priced on these it gets repriced every 12 months. So it doesn't take any future climate change or modeling into account when your insurance gets priced. It just gets repriced next year and the year after and the year after. We have got to start thinking long term. When you buy a house, it is a 30-year investment. You should know what that property is going to look like in 30 years and how risky it's going to be and what the insurance is going to cost on it, because it's probably the biggest investment you'll ever make in your life. Anyway, that was a bit of a rant. I wish I knew the magic solution.
Okay. I am mindful of time, and I appreciate that this is not a happy and fun conversation. It is one we have to have, right? It's a really important one, because we don't mobilise the what we need to do without understanding it. So this week, or the past week, the government, we've had this, the inconsistencies of the current government, where we went from the Woodside Northwest Gas Shelf being approved, which is a horrendous project when it comes to emissions, to a national climate risk assessment that told us things are not looking good and things are dire, and we need to plan on how is government going to deliver the fundamental contract it has with community, and which is to keep our communities safe. At the same time, as an opportunity to say, stake in the ground, what is our mitigation? How are we going to address this problem? Are we genuinely going to try our very best and be consistent with the science? And we saw a target, 62 to 70%. I would say pretty much any scientist will say it's far, far off the mark from what's needed to generally address the risk. 62 to 70% keeps us on a trajectory of 2.7 to 3% of degrees of warming. So it does not put us on a trajectory of mitigating those risks. So we have to get to, so that we don't all leave here feeling very overwhelmed and anxious. You've all three been very active within your industries. What are your top tips for fighting this feeling overwhelming and just too much? What are your top tips for fighting despair or frustration about where we're at and what needs to be done?
I'll start because I'm holding the mic. Look, I'm a natural optimist. I think, at least when it comes to resilience and adaptation, we can do this, absolutely. Human beings throughout history have done incredible feats of scientific transformation and societal change. I mean, just look at COVID. Almost overnight, we had transformational changes in how we behave, in how we work, in how we engage with each other. Almost overnight. We can do this. It is huge and expensive, but we actually have a ton of information about what we need to do. I think we are capable of major transformational change in Australia when it comes to adaptation and resilience and making sure that our homes and communities are safe. I constantly think back about, I wasn't living here when this happened, but I've heard a lot about it. The Snowy Hydro engineering marvel. It was done in 25 years. It included about 100,000 workers and 16 dams, and it is still considered one of the engineering marvels of the world, right? We actually have a ton of incredibly smart people and a lot of resources here, and we could be the model for climate change resilience. The world could look to us and say, that's how you do it. That's how you make homes safer. That's how you make communities safer. It can be done, but it is the kind of investment that government needs to make that is bigger than one budget cycle, that's bigger than one government cycle, it's bigger than one election. It is the kind of investment that shapes our future. But I have no doubt that we can do it and we will do it. The question is, how much harm are we willing to accept before we actually do it?
We had this conversation in our pre-chat. I'm not necessarily a big fan of the word hope because I think there is some decent amount of climate change baked in, but that doesn't mean that what we do doesn't matter. Quite the opposite. It matters all the more. It gets worse the hotter it gets. How do we keep motivated? I think the whole big picture can look pretty grim if you read the news sometimes or read the reports sometimes, but luckily we're kind of all a bit narcissistic, and so I find if I just try and move in a forward direction and try and contribute in my little world, be it with my work or, my kids go out and do land care. I loved working with Zali and team. Or, if you own your own home or if you own an investment property, put on those solar panels, put in the induction stove and the heat pump. I think actually there is a lot we can do as individuals, and that positive action is also about the best thing we can do for our own mental health.
So what gives me hope? And just about my whole life, it's all been about emergencies, and I've seen a lot of tragedy, and it's had a big impact on me. But you see the best in people during disasters. Lismore, all those people who came out in the boats. I was fighting fires on the south coast, and New Year's Eve in 2019, hundreds of homes burnt, and the farmers and young people who came out with their utes, cubes, they called them, little tanks, little pumps. They were doing an incredible job, and it was just spontaneous because they wanted to help people who donated money. You just see the best come out, and it's a can-do thing. We must help each other. So that basic humanity brings us together. And then the other thing, I look at China again, in 1 month has installed more solar and wind power than the rest of the world combined in the last year. And they've hit peak emissions and they're coming down. They've reduced by 1%. And so on their own, they're going to help us win. And then here in Australia, people like us, I love my solar panels, I love my battery, I love my 2 EVs, and I only go to petrol stations to buy a Chiquito chocolate, and that's it. And so to all the gas-guzzling people next door, I say, no. So look, we can do this, we have to do this. I've got 2 grandkids, I'm not giving up, and I hope you don't.
Thank you. Well, I should say what gives me hope is communities like ours, because ultimately we do all have power. We have power in all of our choices as consumers. All these products are there because there's been a demand for them, but you can shut off demand. You can change habits. And as you said, COVID, we saw huge changes in behaviour. So it absolutely can be done. From step one, the choices we make as consumers, like Emma said, induction stoves, your hot water systems. And it's not about throwing everything out. It's just when the time comes to make a choice, to make a change, make it a smart choice. If you're renovating a property, renovate it in a smart way. If you're at a time of needing a new car, buy an EV. They're so much better. If you're at a time of needing a new hot water system, you're renovating your kitchen, think about those changes. There are decision-making points where you can make a difference. It's talking about it, it's sharing the information and having those tough conversations. They can be uncomfortable, but if we don't talk about it, we don't pull the curtain back and address these problems and risks. And I think that's where, for me, our community has been. We have been a lighthouse community in giving hope and being able to embrace change. It's not, nothing is ever impossible. It can always be done. Changing and building political will and accountability is incredibly important. For too long, I think we've had a system where decision-making in Parliament has not been held to account, and vested interest in the big fossil fuel companies have a direct line into the decision-making in the ministers' offices. It is an inappropriately close connection. And that has to change. But every person in Parliament is there because their community has voted for them, right? Everyone, we all have choice and power every time you go to a ballot box or you go to buy or purchase something. And finally, where you have your money. Money matters. So your investments, where you bank, your superannuation, that is powerful. So we do have power to change. We need to change things faster, but at the very least, we need to keep moving things forward. And so for me, it's continuing to have the community's engagement, the talking about it, the not kicking the can down the road to thinking this is a problem for the future. It is a problem for now. It's not an easy problem to fix, but it is absolutely solvable. So on that, I hope everyone can think of something around active hope, what action you are taking in your life, how are you making a difference to stay focused on this, to make sure we do have safe communities and an environment that will support our economy, our future, our kids' lives, and that we can actually have a bigger and better Australia if we acknowledge the risks and plan and adapt to them. So thank you so much for coming out, everyone. Thank you. A huge thank you to Julia, Emma and Greg. You've so generously shared your time for this. I'd like to say a big thank you to my team, lots of volunteers that are here that have helped with this. Our plan is to have more of these events so that we can talk about resilience and risk with more communities, so that we can build that coalition of the willing and of the motivated. So thank you so much. Share the word. Give us your active hope message. We need to stay positive. It is a hallmark of this movement, is that we are always about being positive. I've worn yellow because I feel that yellow is an optimistic colour, and I know we get a lot from the sun. So I think, I hope everyone can think of something positive and optimistic to add to our Active Hope board. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.